Okay, here is the second installment for Urban Sociology, West Virginia State University. The last slide that you saw that we talked about should have been this one. I'm going to adjust my camera just a bit, make sure we're optimal here. We were just kind of finished up with the era of the great metropolis. Now, I want to move into something a little different. I mentioned the idea of eugenics in class on Thursday, the selective breeding of human beings. What we saw happening in this country, again, during this this last era of urban development, again was a lot of fear and people in positions of power wanting to maintain that position of power. We saw fear that we would have too many people and not enough resources. So those powerful people at the top, which were largely white people, waspy people, like we talked about in class, wanted to maintain their power. So they sort of subjectively defined everyone else as weak, or feeble-minded, or not worthy of being able to reproduce or have families. And we'll talk more about that in the implication of eugenics. And all this was kind of happening within the framework of cities, because cities were becoming more prominent than rural areas. More people are now living in cities. People are working in cities. Cities are overcrowded. So all of this is happening within the context of the city. So eugenics, as you just wrote down, the selective breeding of human beings. Well, there's a book that I read some time ago, and it's a really good book. I would recommend it if you ever were inclined to want to read it, called The War Against the Weak by Edwin Black. He wrote it in 2003. For the first 6 decades of the 20th century, hundreds of thousands of Americans and untold other numbers of people were not permitted to continue their families by reproduction, based simply upon ancestry, national origin, race, religion, etc. And people, when I mention this in class, people, my students they almost don't believe it. It's like they've never heard of it. I had never heard of this until I sat through a history of psychology class at West Virginia State College. At the time, it was West Virginia State College, and my professor, Dr. James Spencer, who is still around actually, was talking to us about this, and it just seemed unthinkable that we would have laws on our books up until the 1950s in some states that actually allowed for the forcible sterilization of people who were deemed to be, let's say, feeble-minded or unworthy. And you can guess who those people might have been. We'll talk about the categories of people that were created to fit this category of feeble-minded or not worthy of reproducing. Again, the idea was to keep the population numbers down. So, what does this really mean? Well, the war on the weak was prosecuted in the U.S. by the smartest people in our society, supposedly, professors who were supposed to be smart. Yeah, right, I know. Elite universities, wealthy industrialists, government officials, doctors, lawyers, priests, and we could add to that list, perpetrated against, go figure, minorities, African Americans, Jews, immigrants from Europe, which was like about 1 million people every year from 1880 to 1910, Mexicans, people who had physical or mental disorders, epileptics, petty criminals, alcoholics, the mentally ill, rural white trash, if you will. And these are all terms that I've pulled from his book. These aren't labels that I'm just kind of throwing around to be offensive. These were the labels that were given at the time, and there are others that I didn't list. So you can imagine, I did this with myself. There are probably, at any given time in my life, I would probably fit into 2, maybe 3 of these categories. So had I been born in the wrong, had I been born at the wrong time in this country, even though I was born in this country, I still could have had this war of the weak, if you will, prosecuted against me. Certainly I fit the bill for rural white trash at one time or another, probably. I wouldn't, if I were in a class, I would ask you, but I wouldn't ask you to raise your hands. How many of you have ever had a little bit too much to drink? Maybe you would be characterized as an alcoholic. Maybe you would be considered to be inappropriate for reproduction, and you could be unknowingly and forcibly sterilized, so you could not reproduce other dumb people or feeble-minded people. I would ask how many of you have ever suffered from a mental disorder, a mental illness, maybe depression. 25% of people in this country suffer from depression, 1 out of 4. So that knocks out 1/4 of the population. Petty criminals. How many of you have ever been arrested for a misdemeanor? Again, I would not ask you to really raise your hand. I would ask you to think about it. So it's easy to see how easy it is to fit into these categories. So So what do we have? African Americans, obviously. Our country is rich in history of oppression of African Americans. We could do a whole course on that alone. Certainly the Native Americans were here before probably any of us. And has our country been very kind to Native Americans? My answer would be, well, no, not at all. Immigrant Jews to the U.S. These are Jews from Eastern Europe who have come to the United States were considered to be feeble-minded or perhaps not worthy of reproduction. Latin Americans during this time as well. Irish immigrants. Poor white people. So I could have been right there. Even though I was born in this country, I could have been considered a part of this underclass, if you will. Poor white women. Women who were widowed or were divorced, which was more of a taboo during this time, would be considered possibly to be in this underclass. A marriage prohibition was enacted in the United States to stop race mixing. Again, all this happening within the context of cities in this country. The feeble-minded, and this was a term that was assigned. I didn't make up feeble-minded. Those feeble-minded were those viewed as needing to be eliminated from the human race. That's right, eliminated from the human race. This is starting to sound eerily like some other ideologies and philosophies that were happening in Germany. If you see where I'm going with this, we'll talk about Hitler in just a second. IQ tests were devised. Being a psychologist by trade, I work a lot with intelligence tests. I understand how they're put together. I have an understanding of how they're normed, how they're the questions that are selected, and that the fact that they're supposed to represent certain populations, etc., were devised by the early psychologists in this country to screen out the mentally defective. So in essence, you had immigrants coming into our cities from all over the world, well, largely Eastern Europe, given these intelligence tests that were written in English and normed on culture, value, things that were happening in America. And of course, these immigrants were not doing well on these tests because they didn't speak English a lot of the time, and they had no understanding of our mainstream culture. There was no realization of this. We just assumed that they were stupid, or that they were feeble-minded, and that they were therefore could be forcibly sterilized. In some cases, we sent in our country, in the United States, sent people to Europe to screen prospective immigrants out before they could even come over here. So, and again, this leads to a lot of not good practices. Running through this, you have this whole idea of the genetic transmission of intelligence. This idea that intelligence is largely biological or genetic. That's a misnomer. Now, certainly biology and genetics will have something to do with it, but there was a thought at the time that if you got two smart people, and being smart or intelligent is also very subjectively defined. What makes one smart in this country doesn't necessarily make one smart in another country or another culture, because every country and culture is different. We have many different ways to define intelligence. We tend to focus on one or two types, like the kind that makes you successful in school, the kind that we see with people on Jeopardy who know a lot of stuff. We tend to think of that as someone who is intelligent. Well, there are other types of intelligence we completely ignore, but anyway, I digress. The idea that if you are somehow not intelligent, then if you have a child with someone who is of average intelligence or not intelligent, you're going to have a dumb kid. Well, that doesn't work that way. Unintelligent people create very smart babies. Conversely, very unintelligent adults can have very intelligent babies. So I mean, it can go either way there. Now, the goal at the turn of the 20th century was to immediately sterilize 14 million people in the U.S. That's right, 14 million. Approximately 60,000 people in the U.S. were forcibly sterilized. Those are documented cases that we can prove. And probably most experts do agree on this. Probably many, many more were sterilized, and there's no documentation for it. Some estimates say that it could be in the millions of people that were actually sterilized, but we have no documentation for that. So, eventually, this movement spread from the U.S. to Nazi Germany. Now, I'm very careful right here when I talk about the eugenics movement that did begin here in the United States. It did start here, and the ideas we could make an argument that the ideas started in Britain, kind of made their way into America. Really, in America is where we start to see these ideas turn into behaviors and laws and policies. Now, I'm very careful to say that we did not cause, the United States did not cause Nazi Germany to occur. But what we cannot dispute is that Hitler got his ideas for creating the master human race from what he saw happening in the United States. That is documented. So again, that's not saying we're taking blame for that as a country here in America for what happened in Nazi Germany. But he got his ideas from these practices that he saw happening in our cities, in our urban areas in this country. And we'll leave it at that. Now, Francis Galton was a British psychologist. Again, we mentioned that the early psychologists were the ones that were they were the ones at the front of this movement. Now, Galton advocated that intelligence was inherited, largely ignoring the impact of the environment. You always make the argument, I could have the smartest person in the world, but if I place him or her in a crappy environment with no books and no schools and no teachers and no parental interaction and nothing, this person's not going to do well on a test when he turns 18 years old or when she turns 18 years old because the environment sucked. So we have to we're not taking into account the environment here much, which is unfortunate. And we've learned from that. We've come far from that, thank goodness. He was a major advocate of eugenics. He wanted to improve the human race by selective breeding, by eugenics. Now, Galton felt that the environment could improve the human race, but he thought eugenic practices would do it much more quickly and efficiently. That's why he was a proponent of this movement. He thought that smart people should reproduce, but that the unintelligent should not do so. James Cattell was an American psychologist, again, working during this time, during the Great Immigration. Was also a eugenicist. He also thought that intelligence was hereditary, to the point where he actually offered people money to marry children of professors. Well, there's a lot that's wrong with that assumption. First of all, you have the assumption that professors are the smartest among us. Well, we know that's not true, right? You can say that because I'm not with you in class right now. But seriously, there are a lot of flaws with this logic. Professors are not necessarily the smartest people. And again, children of professors, the idea that if a professor has a baby with, well, anybody, this kid's going to be pretty smart because the professor is brilliant, right? Well, again, not necessarily. So the more intelligent the person is that you reproduce with, the more intelligent that child is going to be, and it's going to keep the population smarter. So there was a financial incentive to do so. So we'll go ahead and call that the end of this part right here, the end of part 2 of 3. Thank you.